Friends, I am very excited to be sharing with you this month's book review where we will be talking about Christopher Penczak's The Plant Spirit Familiar. You can see my copy is very well worn and very beat up. This is a book that I've really valued over the last several years. I've gifted this to folks many, many times over, and it's one that I think you will really enjoy. So before we get into the review and kind of going through the book and talking about some of my favorite parts, I am delighted to announce that I just spoke with Christopher and I'm going to share that little chat with you now. Christopher, thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to me about your book and about plants.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. How's everything for you? What are you up to in life? Anything new and exciting?
Well, speaking of plants, I just got back from a big retreat in Cornwall, England, in Tintagel, called Garden of the Gods, and it was a whole plant spirit medicine week-long adventure. So that was pretty fun. So I'm still kind of recovering. I'm a bit tired from that. And then we just had our public summer solstice and getting ready for a little private summer solstice time now that the public stuff is out of the way, and just keeping on enjoying the summer.
That's awesome. Sounds amazing. I haven't heard of that one. I'll have to look it up. Cornwall is high on my list. My joke is that as soon as I spend any length of time in Wales, I probably will never come back to the States. So I'm planning for that trip, but it's probably going to be a one-way trip if they'll keep me.
I can totally understand that. We try to do little retreats in the Temple of Witchcraft. So we did Wales in like 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. And COVID slowed us down. So we're doing Scotland at the end of this year. And then we're hoping to do Ireland in a couple of years.
Fantastic. Good spots. So the reason we're here today, one of the reasons is to talk about your book, The Plant Spirit Familiar. This is a book, there's a lot of books out there about working with plants, herb magic, green witchcraft, all the words. Few of them contain really unique perspectives, stuff that has really challenged me to think differently about the work and has really given me new inspiration. And this is one of them. My version is really beat up, really well worn, very loved.
I'd love to see that.
I was mentioning earlier, I think I've given this book probably to 8 or 9 different people. So I just keep buying it for myself over and over again, which we love when that happens, right?
Absolutely.
So I love the whole book, but I have a few parts that I think have stood out over the years as my favorite, and are parts that people that I've gifted this book to have been like, man, when he said that's the thing right there. So I was thinking we could maybe just use those sections of the book to just kind of chat. I'm just curious where this came from for you, and we can share a little bit back and forth if that's cool with you.
Absolutely.
So we'll kind of follow the order of the book, and following you and I chatting, I'm going to do a full review of the book and show folks what's inside and go over the index and stuff. So we won't do that here, but start with the first chapter, which is entitled Familiar Spirits. And I really appreciated this chapter because my own, we have I think very similar backgrounds and sort of coming into this work and all of that. And I've kind of moved more into the sorceress arts, but hearing, for the last 30 years of my practice, the familiar spirit, and it's, always in the form of an animal, right? People always get animal spirits. And mine I've always been attached to the plants. That's always been my thing. And to see that reflected in this book was really affirming and edifying for me, that somebody else out there was like, yeah, I've got close friends in the plant world that do work with me. So for you, how does plant familiarship look like in your practice? And, why do you think these relationships of power are worth investing and cultivating and nourishing for those that do plant spirit types of work?
Well, for me, I think it was the deepening of those relationships. Like, things have changed so much over the 30 years I've been practicing. I feel like that's just a short period of time. But the idea of just doing plant magic where you were mixing potions, which is really powerful for me, and I'm not knocking that in any way. But when I started to get into the medicine, I was really blessed to have teachers that were all about partnering with the plants. And even though I was a witch, nobody in witchcraft was really talking about that. That was a really big part of herbalism and flower essences and oils and things like that. The idea of what people now are talking an animistic approach, but people weren't using that word at the time. And really kind of looking at the plant to help you. And it was really the idea that hearing from an herbal teacher, that one of the practitioners in the shop where I was studying had one plant ally that would help them do everything, even though that plant's medicine wasn't good for those things. It was chickweed. So, and I love chickweed, but it's such a little humble plant, and doesn't have a lot of chemical to it when you compare it to like St. John's wort, or you compare it to mugwort or something like that. It's very, very humble, and we don't really know exactly how it works chemically in the same kind of ways. But this person got chickweed to do all sorts of things for them. And when you ask them, well, how'd you do that? Or where'd you get that information? They'd just be like, the plant told me. And so that really deepened kind of my Wiccan experience of just, mix these 5 things together for an incense, or mix these things together for a potion, which I still think is super important. And I start a lot of students there, because I think if I started with talk with the plants, for people who are not in that space, that seems a little crazy. So sometimes you need an experience with the plants before you can start thinking about talking with them. But that's really kind of came out. And that idea of working in the gardens and getting my hands dirty to a level of which I didn't have before that practice. And really singing to the plants and talking to the plants and having them sing and talk back to me and show up in my dreams, and realize they were just a different form of all the other spirits I was already working with. Because at that point I'd done angelic work and spirit guides and deity work and animal spirits and kind of a core shamanism. And so the plants were coming forward as guides on journeys, and coming forward as teachers and givers of information, and energetically healing in different ways. And I realized although they are very different from other types of spirits, they're not, because they're fulfilling those same types of functions. And so that really deepened it. And I started getting into alchemy and getting to the understanding that there's spirit and consciousness in the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms. So to start looking at all 3 of those, not just looking for intangible spirits only, but to realize that everything's a spirit, including you, and how do you commune with that? How do you commune with that intelligence in your body? Realizing each of your organs are a spirit, realizing the food that you're taking into your body is a spirit. So really opening up to what people call that animist spirit right now. But for me, it was just witchcraft.
That's fantastic. And it is interesting. There's this kind of renaissance happening right now in,
Yeah.
within the movement of people wanting that depth, and it's funny because I was talking last week about some of our queer forebears of this work, and talking of course of Paul Byerl and Scott Cunningham. And I was like, something funny about Scott Cunningham is in his Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner, I think is the formal title, that first chapter. And people rag on him a lot. Oh, it's so basic, it's so introductory. No, it's foundation, right? Like you can come back to that. I can go back to his books 30 years later and still find gems that edify my practice. But in the first chapter of that book, which I think is entitled something like Wicca and Shamanism or something, in the language of the time, because they weren't using these anthropological terms, and he wasn't using animism. He said exactly that. That we're in the presence of personhood when we're working with these herbs. And he taught that kind of more reductionist, this herb is good for this thing, and mix these 5 together, and whatever will happen. But the gems, the little seeds, have always been there, and to see them coming into fruition right now is very cool for me. Like very, very cool to watch and experience people approaching the plants in the same way that, just as you mentioned, we've approached mythic heroes and spirits from the various grimoires and whatever. It's very cool, and I think it's opening doors to this work that even 10 years ago very few people were talking about, the way we're talking about it now. It's very cool.
I think it's also important to realize like how we're so open about it now. I really wonder what was said behind closed doors and what was taught from teacher to student, like what Scott put in his books was what could be put in the books at the time, and what was said to students that have been studying with him for 10 years. And did you leave that experience to open up to that person, just give them that little nugget, but not say, okay, I'm going to lead you through this experience? And because that, in the time and the place, and even in witchcraft and magic, might have seemed a little crazy. Like I had the great benefit of walking through the gardens with Paul Barrel, and had a chance to visit with him, and he was talking to the plants, and we talked in a really deep and meaningful way. So I know his teachings and his were a little bit more detailed than Scott's, but I know there's certain things that were only said in those times, mouth to ear, and I think we're very blessed now that we can write about them so explicitly, but then that means there's going to be another layer of things that are not put into words and not put into writing, and are just taught in those direct transmissions between people. But I often wonder that people that we look at as being too simplistic, looking back at works from the 70s and 80s, what was public, what was under the surface that they were talking about or sharing with people, or letting you come to those conclusions yourself and then talking about it. I know even to this day, there's certain things I won't teach until a student says, oh, I had this experience. And then I'll be like, oh, let's talk about that, but it's not something I'm necessarily putting down in a lesson plan.
Yeah. The mysteries that were being worked in the 70s are the same mysteries that we're working now. We're all grinding the same mortar and pestle. I think that's really an astute angle, that like what we can drop on Instagram in 2023 would have been too much even for a book, an occult book in the 70s and 80s. But these incredible, I consider them our working ancestors. They found ways to just leave those little seeds, and now they're coming to fruition, and it's just very cool to me. Very cool.
I agree.
Let's see, what else can we talk about? Chapter 2, another one of my favorites, entitled Plant Spirits, and this is one of my favorite conversations to have with people. When we talk about plant spirits, the wisdom of plants, the magical power, the medicinal potency, the personhood of plants. How do you experience that? What does that plant spirit look like, feel like, show up in your practice?
I think it depends on the plant, honestly. Some of them are very, what you see is what you get. Sometimes when I'm talking to lemon balm in the spirit world, lemon balm looks like a lemon balm, it's just as it does in the physical world. And it may communicate telepathically, or I may translate. I tend to be a wordy person, so a lot of spirits kind of translate into language for me, even though I know they're not speaking English, but that's how I'm, kind of absorbing it through my psychic senses. Some of them are more anthropomorphized. Particularly for me, the banes, the poisonous plants, as kind of the initiators, tend to come out more anthropomorphized. I think if we think of a lot of the more modern fairy work that's out there right now, you could say that they take on kind of an elvish, fairyish kind of quality, but of the green, although the fairies are also of the green on a certain level too. So like one of my favorites and strongest allies, and she loves it when I talk about her, so I'm going to talk about her, is Datura. And so Datura comes across as this very beautiful woman, kind of light green skinned, but very clawed and very jagged, because Datura is also thorn apple. So the seed pods have those spikes to them. So her teeth are spiky, her fingers are spiky, and she's sort of veiled sometimes behind this very white hair. Much like the flower, the shades of the flower that blooms. So, for her, she comes across very much in an anthropomorphized way. And I know that's not necessarily who she is, but that's how she translates. I think a lot of psychic spirit work is about trying to find interfaces so we can understand each other. And so sometimes they come across in that human form, because that's a convenient way for them to communicate and share experiences with us. Other times they're very, I hesitate to say angelic, but almost like, think of like a magnet, and if you think of like the old school book kind of images of the magnet, where you'd have a bar magnet and you'd have like a field, like a torus going around it, but it looks like wings. And so they'd kind of look like energy fields that almost look like wings, and not have personhood and not have planthood, but have just kind of energetic shape and geometry to them as well. So I think a lot of the tree spirits are kind of present that way to me. They're very kind of geometric tube torus, almost wing-like fields of energy that are rotating. So I guess it depends on the experiences. And over time, they've changed too. I think sometimes a spirit, whether it's a plant or not, presents one way, so you can kind of comprehend it. and then it sort of peels back the skin and shows you a little bit more of what it really is, and then it gets really abstract and shows you things that are hard to comprehend linearly, but I think it's probably closer to their nature.
Fantastic. Really well said. I tell people all the time that, without going into too much in this space, that what work done in this realm of the green and in plant spirit world in the green realm with our herbal allies is very much a fey art. That we are very much in the space of the good folk, and that respectful awareness is very important. And I think one thing that I've really gotten over the years, and that I like to teach people, especially early on, is that there's something about the coevolution of the plant person and the human person that they will oftentimes come to us in a way that is the most evocative, for the transmission, that their language is sometimes so different from ours that it goes over the average head. But it's almost like, if we can slow down to tree speed and they can speed up to human speed, they'll come through in these ways that mean something to the individual. So if we're doing plant spirit workings together and everyone in the group has a very different, image or experience or teaching from the plant, I think our minds want to go to that it invalidates it. Like, oh, we there's no agreement, so it's not good. But it's like, no, this is showing the real power of these arcane plant spirits, that they are able to speak to you in your own language. They're able to come in and pull syntax from your heart and say, this is what means to you the thing I'm trying to give you. So this is what it's going to come through as. Sometimes. Oh, God, sorry.
I'm gonna say, I think plants also experience, they pull that syntax. I love that. It's a beautiful way to think of it, from memory. And so all of us have different memories. And I think particularly I think all spirits do that, but I think particularly with plants, the scent triggers memory. So I know when I'm communing with plants, I'll have flashes to like childhood stuff. And my first thought always was like, oh, you need to focus. Like, this is what we're doing. Don't focus on that. But then I realized, oh, that's their way of speaking. Like, they're either conjuring a feeling, and that feeling has a chain of associations that they're trying to convey to me, or an essence or an understanding. And I think because in many ways they're so pre-verbal, they try to get to that childhood memory, and they try to get to that, understanding of that primal, and I think a lot of that comes through that childhood aspect. But your childhood was different than mine. So I think when we encounter that, what they trigger in you is going to be different than what they trigger in me. But just like people, my relationship with somebody in my coven is going to be different than my relationship with you. Is going to be different than a coworker that I have. I'm still me, but those relationships trigger different things in different people, because those relationships are different.
Absolutely. They do love to go on and flip switches in the limbic system, and just get those those memory lines open. That is really important thing to remember, that, like, as I tell people in guided journeys, whatever comes up from wherever it comes up is worth your investigation, is worth contemplating,
Work with what shows up. Absolutely.
Yeah. Another section that I really love, maybe we'll just do like one or two more for time's sake, is the section on building relationships with the plants, which is, 99% of what people have to listen to me talk about, is how do we enter into intentional, conscious, reciprocal relationships with these spirits. I'm approaching it a little more from a kind of a sorceress aspect, but that sacred reciprocity, that gift exchange that we see mirrored in all of the magical traditions forever, is one that the plants very much respond to. So when folks start thinking in terms of, okay, now I want to get in, now I want to put my, hands in the dirt, so to speak. How do you like to think about, kind of forging these relationships with not only a non-human spirit, but a spirit that is sometimes so radically different than us that people can really get hung up on, having a relationship else. It's easy with animals because we have companion animals. I think that's like the next step, but plants challenge us to flex those reciprocity muscles in some interesting ways. So how do you kind of like to approach that, building relationships with plants?
I mean, for me, I would say probably one of my most precious resources is time. And so it's putting that time in. And I think we live in a very fast-paced society. So when we take the time to pause, that is one of the biggest things we can give. I think it's still important to do offerings and do all the magical rituals and things like that and communicate. But whatever you're carving out that time. I think, unfortunately, we sort of have a magical mindset in the modern era of one and done. And I like that for magic, for a simple spell, I want to do that spell. I want to let it go. I want it to manifest and not worry about it again. I'm not so much about the repeating spells over and over again, unless they're like boards or something that requires upkeep. But I think for relationships, I always compare it. I do sort of anthropologize that in the sense of, if I have somebody I've met and then I make the assumption that they're there as my friend, and we've only hung out once, I'd be in error. And so thinking about with a spirit, if I've met that spirit, if I've communed with that plant once and we had a good exchange, but they're not my friend until I've really put the time into it. And so for me, it's a lot of vision work, journeying and going just to speak with the spirit. I also, have the benefit of having garden spaces and getting to grow a lot of these things, whether they're in pots or whether they're in the garden outside. We have a whole poison garden here at the temple. And so to be able to kind of cultivate that relationship, a lot of them from seed, or having some of them scatter their seeds and like to grow in those wild places. Who's going to come up this year and who doesn't come up this year? Like this year was a no henbane year. I don't know why the henbane's not here. It's taken a rest, but some of the Datura righty showed up, which I didn't purposely plant, but their seeds got scattered. So we're working with that one. And I've not seen any of the Datura stramonium this year. So realizing that friends can also kind of come and go, but being on the lookout for them. Who's around, who wants to talk to you when you go into meditation, kind of opening the space to say, who wants to come forward? Sometimes we're so task oriented that we think, oh, I've got a problem. I need to go to this spirit and I'm going to solve that problem. And sometimes meditation and that reciprocity is, who needs to talk to me? Who wants to talk to me? Let me go to the inner garden and say, who's going to catch my attention? Who needs to hear? Whose voice do I need to hear? And being open to that small and still and silent voice of, maybe it's not a problem, but it's that spirit that wants your attention, and taking that time, or just kind of making the space in my practice to not make it be all about me. And then asking in those spaces, what in the physical world do you want? Is it the tending of water and fertilizer and all those practical things? Is it you want, ritual to you? Is it that you want me to share you in teachings? I find that the plants really like to have their name spoken, really like to have their information shared, really like to be introduced to other people. So that's sometimes my agreement with a lot of the plants, but I would do it without the agreement too, just saying, I think these are the plants to work with, or let me take people through the garden and show off the plants and introduce them to other people, is a way of bringing that reciprocity that they've asked from me. But it's figuring out for you, what do they want from you, and taking the time to ask and really listen. And if you're not somebody that really hears very well, to be open to messages in your dreams, or if you have an array of things you'd like to offer the plants and you don't really hear clearly, use your pendulum or any other type of yes/no divination to say, is this what you want? Nope. Okay. Is this what you want? Yep. Nope. Kind of going through that process and really building it in that way and putting the time into it. But for me, it's really time. Time is the most precious thing. So taking the time to slow down, to not have an agenda, to just build a friendship is the most important thing. Because I think I tend to be very task oriented. So to not be so task oriented, I think the garden just is, and so just wants to sometimes be with you. So can I just slow down and shut up and be with it,
Yeah, I like that. I've been going on and on a lot lately about, encouraging people to engage more bioregionally with their herb magic. That, we have these cool herbs that are in all the books that you've got to order online or go to the herb shop or whatever. And that's awesome, because those are herbs we've selectively been in relationship with for so long. But there is something to be said about, coming home at the end of a long day and realizing that a little stand of yarrow has popped up next to your doorstep that you didn't really notice, and taking that as an invitation,
Right.
Realizing that those plants, when they're there, that it's happening, that something is going on, a conversation is being started, a little handshake is happening. So I tell people, when you notice them and when they pop up, follow that little green thread and see where, and maybe it goes nowhere and it's they're doing their thing and you're doing your thing and you can share space respectfully, but more often than not, there is some interesting conversation to be had on whatever level, it's going to be had. And I wanted to mention, you mentioned the tending to the inner garden work, which is really beautiful practice that is in the Plant Spirit Familiar book. So that is unfamiliar to anybody. You get this, you buy this book and you read it and then
Yeah, I'd say even with the things that show up, I'm a hermeticist at heart. So as above, so below, as within, so without. If something's there, it's not always human-centric reason, but there's always a correspondence. One of the unpopular things I've been teaching lately, and so I'll share it with you because it may be popular or unpopular with your viewers, is the idea of if something particularly invasive shows up as well. There's that tendency just to want to rip it out if you realize it's invasive. And I'm not saying necessarily plant invasive things, but if it's shown up in your environment, I think there's a correspondence, and start learning about it, kind of get the respect of it, sit down and talk with it, journey with it. And particularly, I think one of the greatest ways to work with invasive species is to use them for magic and medicine. So rather than just assume like, oh, I need to rip this out, or I'm not obviously a big person to pour chemicals on things to get rid of stuff. So what can you get rid of that might be invasive by using it? And therefore put it to a sacred purpose. Like I think of all the invasive stuff that we have here in New England, and so much of it is medicine or food. Like we're rampant right now, and our forest here in the temple is rampant with some Japanese knotweed. And so knotweed is a really good cardiovascular medicine, and it's also not a cure, but an aid for Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is rampant in this area. So, I'm making deals with the knotweed of like, I'm going to pull you out of this section and I'm going to put you in pots so I can get your root more easily. And I'll propagate you in the pots if you'll stop growing in the garden. And so far it's not stopped growing in the yard, but I feel like I'm putting it to sacred use. And this will be my first year really trying to harvest the root for that medicine and for that work. And we'll see how it goes, and we'll see who needs it. And, I always find too, what shows up will often be the medicine that's needed for the winter. So if it's like right now, the elder is popping. So, to me, that means it's going to be a bad flu year, so kind of looking for that. Or if the St. John's wort is popping, that usually indicates the year is going to have some trauma to it. And that's the plants communicating with us collectively. So we'll see what happens, but that's what's on my mind too when things pop up in that way. What does it have to say for me? What does it have to say for the collective? How does it want to be used? How can you make the process a little bit more sacred than just thinking like, oh, this popped up where I didn't want it to be, popped up there for a reason.
I like that.
It's not about you.
Yeah. The reality is that, I think the human experience of being divorced from the whole of things, which is always the hot topic, right? We are partofness is a huge part of this practice for me, is always reminding myself that I belong here, that I am as much nature as tree, river, mountain, whatever. And one of the consistent teachings of all the plant spirits for me is constantly that the heart, the self, however you want to idealize that, is always in a state of communication with the cosmos. There's always communication happening. And so it's really, from that perspective, impossible to walk through the world and not have nature respond to your presence and what you are working and what you're carrying. That the animals will respond, the plants that show up or don't show up will respond, the weather will respond to you being here, because if you weren't here, it would be a different conversation, right? So I think there's some intelligent sort of filtering that can happen, but I do think there's something magical, and I think a lot of us did this as kids. There's something magical about walking through the world feeling like the symphony of nature that is going on is we're just as much a note of that as anybody else, and that there's always something to learn. There's always something to receive and something to respond to.
And
which is very,
when it's
very
not
cool.
conscious, think of our breath. We're constantly exchanging, particularly with the green world. I might not be thinking this is information, but breath, air, information, knowledge, consciousness, it's all kind of flowing back and forth, even when we're not consciously thinking about it. It's still what supports and sustains us.
Yeah, breath is the greatest disrespected ritual, right? That's always happening. We're always people, how do I get into ritual with the green realm? You
Right.
already are. It's not a process of doing, it's a process of paying attention to what's already happening, right? Last, but can we do one more?
Sure.
We'll pull from chapter 5, Balms, Banes, and Tree Teachers, which there's a lot of really fantastic, I call them handshakes, little introductions to a lot of plants that I think must be really, important to you, special to you. And I like the way that this chapter was put together, and the way that you talk about this kind of stuff actually in a lot of your books, to expand, because it's, instead of just like bullet points of like, here are all the things rose is good for, here's all the ways you can use rose. It's almost more of a poetic introduction. Like, let me tell you a little bit about this friend I have. And it's just enough to be like, do I want to hang out with this person and learn for real or not? So I wonder, this is just a fun question. And I know it's an impossible one to truly answer, but who, just in the moment, you mentioned Datura, of course, who else is, makes up kind of part of your core working group of plants that you love and that you do a lot with, one way of magic, medicine, ritual, beauty, whatever?
My 3 kind of core ones that have stayed with me for years and years and years, kind of using what I wrote about in terms of balms, the healing herbs, the banes, the poisons, and the tree teachers, would be lemon balm, datura, and red oak. Those are kind of my 3 solid, deeply there for me all the time. Since I wrote that book, people started giving me, strangely and wonderfully strangely, because I'm very blessed for it, mandrakes. So I have really rotten luck trying to grow mandrake from seed, and I failed at that at one point. Didn't really talk about it. I'm pretty private, even with social media stuff. And as I was touring for the Plant Spirit Familiar and doing lectures and events and traveling the country, people started bringing me baby mandrakes. And so since that time, I've been raising mandrakes. I'm really loving the black mandrake, the autumnalis, Mandragora autumnalis. And it's been really profound, and it's helped open up doors to other ones. So like, there was an old teaching that if you really worked with datura, then belladonna wouldn't work so well with you. And if you really worked with belladonna, datura wouldn't be so good. And then start working with mandrake, and both have been really good. So I've had almost every year now, whether I've intended to or not, I've had both belladonna and datura in my garden. And belladonna has become a great ally as well. So though datura has always been kind of my key one and kind of opened the door of the banes to me, belladonna has been huge for it. At the moment, though, I'd say the plant that I'm sort of been obsessed with, that has been grown the most the last 2 years in our gardens, and I'm just really trying to learn all this stuff about, has been evening primrose. So evening primrose is a native plant that just kind of seeded itself, and really kind of working with that. It was interesting. The tincture of it is really good for any type of irritation, particularly of like bronchial stuff and things like that. So I unfortunately contracted COVID last October, and that was my big ally I recovered through it really quickly, but then had this lingering cough for months. But to kind of help me through the cough was the evening primrose. And when I take that, it would be like a little temporary respite from the cough symptoms that I had. So it was really nice to have had the intuition to, oh, I need to make this into medicine during the summer. And then I had it for the fall for when I needed it. And a few years before that, one that I got really deeply into, although it's not growing so much right now, I use it as a flower essence and a tincture, has been wild prickly lettuce. And wild lettuce is really great for dreams, and is really a deep ally to kind of bring you into unseen parts of yourself and your consciousness. And you can take the tincture of it and dry it out, and it leaves this little latex behind, and you can add that latex to dream incenses and things like that. So I'll sometimes burn that before doing a dream ritual. I'm very big into dream rituals. And so wild lettuce has been really helpful, but it just shows up all over in the garden. So those are like my little takes to get to know something. So for about 3 years in a row, wild lettuce was everywhere. And I started working with it more deeply, and I still visit with it occasionally, not as much as I did those years. And now it doesn't grow in the garden anymore. So sometimes gardens, spirits come in and plants come in, and then you work together, and then they may leave for a time, but they because you've put in the time to it, they always sort of linger with it. But those are some ones that are particularly prevalent that, are not necessarily in the book, at least the primrose and the wild lettuce.
Very cool. Yeah, and I think the plants that, well, for starters, once those connections are made, they're always there, and that I sort of visualize it like a thread in a spider's web, that when that plant is the right plant for you, because the connection has been made and you've nourished it and kind of put the work in, whether it's some part of us or some part of the plant, can kind of pluck that string when it's time for them to come back in. Like, you now know that plant on a level that allows for your body to crave them or to intuitively think of them when that's the right medicine for you, or maybe for somebody you're working with, a client or whatever. And so that act of, kind of just coming full circle to putting the work in, to knowing the personhood of the plant, that's where this goes, and it may be that you get 10 close ones in your whole life, but I tell my students all the time, one herb, when you know one herb well enough, you can fix any problem, internal, external, medicinal, magical, with one herb, right? Like, because it's moving, like you said, beyond the phytochemistry, beyond the tissue state, and into the cosmic state, which is very cool.
Right. I think back to my herbalist with chickweed, like she got chickweed to do everything for her.
That's to me the goal. Like, that's when people like what to aspire towards relationships that are that deep, that are that powerful, that you could come to an herb that, in the books has nothing to do. There are no bullet points about that herb approaching, this particular disharmony in somebody's life. And because it's you asking, that plant steps up and that medicine comes through, because they can do that, right? And another really important thing I think that you bring up is that those plants that show up, whether it's through research or intuition, or because our herbalist told us to take them, whatever the case is, but the ones that show up and help us heal, get us through the pain or the discomfort or the fear, we never forget that medicine. That plant is in there forever. As when I was going through this thing, this is the plant that made it so much more bearable, or helped me finally resolve the issue. And those are the ones I think we start to proselytize, right? We can't wait to tell anybody's like, oh, I got a little frog in my throat. Oh my God, you go straight to the deep respiratory herbs. You gotta try this herb. It's gonna fix you. We're friends. We go way back. Cool, man. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Right, well, it was a lot of fun.
For all your books. Do you have any books in the works or tours or anything folks could look out for if they want to kind of get to know you a little bit more and hang out with you a bit?
I've been teaching more online than touring, just as the way the world has been going on. But if you check out my website or the Temple of Witchcraft website, you can see what I'm up to and where I'm going to be physically or where I'm going to be online. And I do have a lot of books in the works. I'm hoping everything, the way the world has slowed me down a little bit, but I've got a bunch of books that are in the works. I've got one called Sabbatic Visions that is sort of the classes I did during COVID. And it's a kind of heretical look at the Wheel of the Year. I know as pagans, we often talk about how we want to sort of divorce ourselves from, Christian theology and imagery, or talk about how they stole things from us. So this is my subversive plan to steal things that are interesting back from them. So sort of looking at some of the folklore of seasonal rites and what Christian mysteries have gotten woven into that and how they're really kind of witchy. But some people loved it, some people hated it. So I'm very excited about that, turning that series into a book. So that should hopefully be out next year. I have a book on sort of alchemy and the myths of the Cauldron, particularly the stories of Caradwyn, but it's a very occultist look at Caradwyn rather than a Reconstructionist, Celtic Reconstructionist view of Caradwyn. So we're going to be looking at the mysteries of birth and the cycles of conception and rebirth through initiation, and getting to things from plant spirit medicine to cell salts and homeopathy and things like that in our healing transformation of rebirth.
Very cool.
And then I've got another third book coming out on the witch's soul and looking at kind of the different models of the 3 souls and the 9 souls and the 12 souls, and really trying to figure out what that means for a modern witch and how to kind of correlate Celtic and Norse and Egyptian and Hebrew kind of imagery into something that works for modern people, and how to kind of go deeper into the consciousness of their own bodies and their own souls.
That's awesome.
That's the
We'll read
plan.
all
So hopefully
those.
the next 2 years or so, we'll get those books out soon.
Yeah, we'll circle back in a year or two and talk about all the new stuff.
That'd be great.
And I will put links to your sites and your books and everything down in the details below, so folks can go check out your work and buy your book and support what you're doing. And with that, thanks again. Hopefully we'll cross paths again soon. I really appreciate all of your what you do, your work, and what you share. And we keep sharing it as much as possible.
Thank you. If you ever make it up to the New England area, we're just about an hour north of Boston. So please let me know. Come for a visit.
Very cool. That's fantastic.
All right. Take
All
care.
right. Thanks a lot.
You well.
See ya. Such a great conversation. What a sweet guy. Learned a lot, and it was really awesome to connect to him and learn more about what was behind this book. So just going to do a brief overview of this book, because I know that after hearing that interview, you are going to probably have your own copy of this very soon. So again, the name, The Plant Spirit, Familair, Christopher Penczak, and this one was published in 2011. And I'm just going to pop open to the table of contents and read a couple of the sections to you that I really like. This is a pretty standard size book, but there's a ton of information packed into very small spaces. It's still very approachable and very digestible. Again, can't recommend this one highly enough. So first, as we mentioned in the chat and the interview, there's a whole section in here where Christopher gets into the familiar spirit, what that spirit is, what they mean to the practitioner, how they relate to animal spirits and witchcraft traditions. And it's really interesting how he makes a segue into the familiar spirit as a plant spirit. I really appreciated that. Then we get into chapter 2, the plant spirits, where Christopher talks about modern paths of green wisdom, homeopathy, flower essences, and the like, talking a bit about modern herbalism and alchemy and fairy faith and shamanic traditions of plant spirit work. Very, very cool chapter. Totemic plants, where we look at the 3 kin, the way that Christopher practices, the balms, the banes, and the tree spirits, which we talked a little bit about in our chat as well. And then chapter 4, fantastic section on cultivating your allies. And in this section, we've got various practices around breathing, around making offering to plant spirits, around journeying with them. This is probably one of my favorite sections of the book. The rituals are really simple, but really beautiful. The way that Christopher has brought a traditional witchcraft hoozle into plant spirit work is really, really very cool. Then we get into looking at various individual plants in chapter 5. And in chapter 6, there is a magical process everywhere from casting a sacred circle to invoking plant spirits to doing ritual work, which is something I think folks involved in all forms of witchcraft will really appreciate. And then the rest of the book is kind of deeper dig into green gnosis, into trying to win the initiations of the plant spirit, going deeper into the work. There are some very powerful rituals in here for attaining a green teacher, for working with various deities of plant spirit work. And I really appreciate, as I'm sure none of you will be surprised by, that Christopher has a section in here dedicated to the deity that we call the Green Man, who is one that I work with a lot. So there's some information in there. Again, really beautiful book. Forgive, mine is beat up and marked and lots of bookmarks. I've referenced this book in both of the books that I wrote, and it's one that I cannot recommend highly enough. So if you don't have this on your bookshelves already, please go out and get it. Support Christopher, leave him a review. As mentioned, He also does lots of online classes and festivals and in-person stuff. And I'm going to link to his books and to his website and calendar down below, so you can go check out what he's doing. Make sure that you tell him that you found him through this interview, and hopefully you enjoyed this month's book club. I'll see you next time.